Chapter 1. Karen's Melancholy. When Karen Kuromaki returned to the real world, the thin digital clock on her wall indicated that it was 5:49 p.m. on Sunday, January 18th, 2026. Her apartment was devoid of human presence. The compact bedroom connected to a larger living room through a sliding doorway. The windows were dark after the sun had set, so only the LED hanging from the ceiling offered any illumination. The walls were all painted a soft white. A thick cream-colored rug decorated the living room, in the center of which featured a large, low table and cushions. A full-length mirror stood in the corner. The bookshelf along the wall was packed with texts and reference books painstakingly ordered by subject. The orderly interior spoke volumes about its resident's personality. The bedroom, which was currently open to the living room via the sliding door, featured a low wooden bed and a wide dresser on the wall opposite the window. Karen sat up in her bed and removed the atmosphere, the device on her head that covered her face and sent all her senses into the virtual world, then laid it carefully on the right side of her pillow. Wearing the pale yellow pajamas, she spun her legs over the left side of her bed, letting her feet touch the ground, and stretched, her left hand towards the wall. The sensors recognized her movement and slowly powered up the room. After allowing her eyes a few seconds to adjust to the light, Karen got to her feet. With 2 barefoot steps, she reached the living room. A clothing rack was next to the standing mirror, and it included one object that was definitely not clothing. Karen grabbed it and faced the mirror. There she saw herself, a grumpy-looking reflection, a girl with long black hair who stood 6 feet tall. She held a black plastic air gun, the same P90 she clutched just moments ago, but appeared much smaller now. Slowly, Karen's lips moved. Squad Jam. Should I even bother? A team PvP battle. I don't know if I feel up to that. Karen Kuromaki grew up without wanting for anything. Her parents were originally from the Amori Prefecture before moving across the Tsugaru Strait of Hokkaido, where they started a successful business. Fertility smiled upon them as well, giving them 2 sons, 2 daughters, and then on April 20th, 2006, their last child, Karen. And so, in a large and comfortable home in the north, it was under the doting eye of her parents and the much older siblings that the precious baby Karen grew, and grew, and grew, and grew. Her growth spurt started in 3rd grade, and by the time she was entering middle school, Karen was already 5'7". She'd prayed and prayed that her height wouldn't climb any higher, but God gave no inclination that he was listening. Instead, she kept growing right through middle school, and now that she was 19, she stood at 6 feet tall. Maybe that wouldn't be so rare in other countries, but this was Japan. Her family and close friends understood how Karen felt, so they never mentioned her height. But the ordinary people of the society were not so considerate. In middle and high school, she was inundated with requests and invitations from school sports clubs, which she had no real desire to join. She knew when someone was asking her merely because she seemed to have aptitude for the sport, but they didn't care how she felt about it. She didn't like that. When walking in public, she was often described by others as the giant woman, and there were surprisingly many who insulted her loudly enough that they intended her to hear it. No matter how much this upset her, there was nothing she could do about it. Her personal complex about her height changed her during puberty. Little Karen was the very picture of innocence and liveliness, such that she could often be confused for a rambunctious little boy. and now she hardly ever spoke a word to anyone she didn't know closely, looking inward for her personal pleasures like reading and listening to music. She even grew out her hair, hoping it might somehow make her more girlish, but that only resulted in her losing track of when to cut it, and she ended up with so much hair that managing it all in the morning was a pain. Being tall took a toll on her wardrobe too. Karen gave up on the idea of feminine fashion and turned to rougher and simpler outfits. 1 year ago, Karen graduated high school and moved to Tokyo. Her original plan was to go to a local college, but she had taken a flyer for one of the most prestigious women's schools in Japan, which happened to accept her. Her parents had been delighted and arranged for her to stay in a unit at a luxury apartment building where Karen's eldest sister and her husband lived. In April of 2025, Karen began life on her own in the big city, hoping that a new place might change something for her. However, once she started at the prestigious women's college, she found more than of the same. Given her age, she at least didn't have to worry about the other people teasing her directly anymore, but Karen was otherwise ill-suited to the traditional benefits of the typical college life, trying out new fashions, participating in clubs, going on dates, and so on. On top of that, this college was an escalator school, meaning most of the students had come up through its attached primary and secondary schools, so she didn't make any new friends she could truly open up to, although some of that blame was on Karen, who was introverted and didn't make efforts to reach out to others. Her daily schedule consisted of attending classes, eating lunch alone, listening to music with her earbuds during her break time, returning to the apartment, and spending her free time alone there. The only people she interacted with were her family and friends back home. The only people she spoke to in person were her sister's family members when she invited over for dinner with her niece. Her parents forbade her from taking a part-time job and sent her an ample allowance she couldn't possibly burn through. She began worrying that if she didn't learn to be more social, she'd start to forget how to interact with people altogether. Then, when she was back home for the summer vacation, a particular news article on the internet caught her eye. Virtual reality games make a massive comeback. Desire from the public to enjoy a different life is still strong. VR technology allowed the user to experience total sensory immersion by placing a special device on one's head that delivered electronic signals to and from the brain. Thus, a VR game used this full dive technology to bring together multiple players into the same perceived space over the internet. Karen was familiar with the concept. Nearly everyone in Japan was. The technology had been at the center of an incident that had shocked the entire nation, perhaps the world, when she was in her first year of high school in November 2022. Sword Art Online, often known as SAO, the world's first VR MMO RPG, virtual reality, massive multiplayer online role-playing game, had turned into a horrifying nightmare through the malice of its genius developer. 10,000 players who first logged on to its launch day found themselves trapped inside the VR world, unable to leave the game of their own accord. Even worse, if their in-game character died, or if someone attempted to force the device off the player's head, the device would output microwaves that fried the user's brain and killed them. It had become a deadly game, literally. The incident was constantly headline news right after the crisis began, but the days kept passing without a solution. Each time a new victim died, everyone heard the familiar and dispiriting refrain of the news cycle. Eventually, the incident simply faded from memory, except for those poor souls whose loved ones were still trapped inside. 2 years later, in November of 2024, while Karen was Cramming for her college entrance exams, SAO became major news again. This time it was good. The people trapped in the game of death were finally free. Ultimately, however, 4,000 lives had been lost, and SAO was forever known as the deadliest video game in history. But only those who already hated the idea of VR games actually thought this would be the end of those dangerous things. Even while some players were still captive in SAO, plans for a new device, it's safe this time, were drawn up and brought to market along with new games. The article stated, as of the summer of 2025, the number of VR games continue to rise. The player population is exploding at such a pace that it almost appears as though the traumatic incident of the recent past never happened. These games provide more real sensory simulations of life than ever before, allowing users to experience a different self. But is this really healthy in a humanistic sense? If you want to feel something with all your senses, get off your computer and do what we used to tell children in the old days. Venture outside. If our children are raised in virtual worlds with no sense of real pain, is it possible that they might go on to commit crimes, the likes of which we adults can never imagine? A much-needed rational debate is waiting to be held. The article was openly critical of VR games and dripping with the author's bias and distaste, but it had actually stoked the opposite opinion in Karen. A different self? Maybe, she'd thought. If I play a different person in a game, I might start a conversation with other people more often. Maybe it could work as a kind of therapy or social rehabilitation for real life. She never had any interest in VR before then, but now she had a purpose. When she learned that one of her few friends from back home had VR experience, she went to go ask her about it. Miyu had said, "Oh my gosh, I'd love to have another friend to play with." She enthusiastically taught Karen all about it. Soon, it became clear that current VR games had none of the danger of SAO. She decided to try it out. There was no reason to waste any time once she'd made up her mind about it, and her stuffy old parents weren't likely to look kindly upon such activities at home, so Karen ended her vacation early and went back to Tokyo. She'd visited an electronics store immediately after landing in Haneda Airport and procured all the essentials for the activity. First up was the Atmosphere, which resembled a giant set of silver goggles. The device blocked all organic senses and sent only artificial ones into the user's brains. In other words, Karen would be in something like a coma while operating it, although the Atmosphere did have several safety measures. While it shut out her real senses, it also monitored them. If the device detected the user's heart rate rising abnormally, drastic slowness of breathing, or the presence of a headache or stomach pains, it automatically shut down features would kick in, and they were impossible to remove or override. The Atmosphere also connected to real-world home security features like home invasion and fire alarms, as well as emergency services such as earthquake and tsunami alerts to ensure that it shut down when necessary. Karen had also bought a game. Out of all the VR games available, she picked Alfheim Online, ALO, which Miyu already played. It was set in a fantasy world where players turned into winged fairies and went on adventures together. You'll love it, Koei. Yeah, it gets a little dicey when various races fight it out, but you don't have to do that stuff if you don't want to. It's super fun just flying around in this beautiful world and chatting with everybody, Miyu assured her. Sure enough, the sample screenshot on the package promised a gorgeous world of dazzling green forests and deep blue skies and lakes. It was that pretty to look at in pictures, surely being there would feel a million times better. Her heart soared at the thought of being able to fly with her own set of wings. With Miu's help over the phone, Karen set up the atmosphere with her computer and finally made the very first full dive of her life. She'd changed into pajamas, closed the curtains, and turned on her air conditioner, as these made for the most comfortable conditions, apparently. Then she put the plugged-in atmosphere on her head, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. "Link, start!" The vocal command instantly took Karen's mind to another world. First, there was the sensation of leaving the body, like drifting off to sleep. Then suddenly she was standing in darkness and received voiced instructions. She knew it wasn't the real world, but her wits were quite sharp. It was like a walking dream, where she knew it was a dream while it was happening around her. With her heart racing in excitement, Karen followed the instructions and began to type the required information into the floating keyboard before her. For her character's name, she'd taken the Ren from her name and tweaked some of the letters to ensure it didn't match the name of any other player, doubling the consonants and putting it all in caps. Len. She had the choice of 9 different fairy races, but she wanted to play with Miu, so she elected for Sylph, the Wind Fairy. Since each race started in its own territory, this would make it easy for her to meet up with Miu right away. Once Karen had become Len, she stepped into the world of ALO. Why? And screamed. "I'm sorry, Kouhi, I completely forgot you have that thing about your height," Miu apologized over the phone. But the fact that the avatar Karen wound up with, which was generated at random by this game system, happened to be noticeably taller than the others of the Sylph races wasn't Miu's fault at all. The shock of seeing herself in a mirror sent Karen's pulse racing, kicking in the atmosphere safety measure and automatically unlinking her from the program barely 20 seconds after she started the game. "Listen, I know that must have been horrible, but there are races with much smaller avatars on average. The Khajiits are cat fairies, for example. Why don't you just try rolling a fresh character? It's a charged microtransaction, unfortunately." Karen declined Miu's offer. It wasn't an issue of money. The shock of being very tall, even as the result of a random roll, had immediately soured her on the entire concept of ALO. She still wanted to try VR games, but she was not going back to that one. So she apologized to Miu for the bad news, after all of her friends' help. "I see. Well, that's too bad. But I guess I can't blame you. That stubbornness of yours is one of your strengths, in my opinion," her old friend said. Then she asked, "Kouhi, are you familiar with character conversion?" That referred to an act of moving Len's character she had just created to a different VR game. All the VR games in existence were based on the same foundational system, an engine known as the Seed. All a player needed to move characters around was a simple user ID, and the strength of the character would be converted and preserved in a new game. It would start that new game in a powerful form already. The original would be destroyed, and all items and in-game money lost. But that meant nothing to Karen, of course. Best of all, the ID she had created wouldn't go to waste that way. This was her shot to get the avatar she really wanted. "Yeah, it'll be a different game, but feel free to ask me for help if you have any questions. Next time I try to get live tickets to Elsa Kanzaki concert in Tokyo, I'm going to stay with you as payment for all this help, okay?" Miu said, and Karen promised to do her that favor. Afterward, Karen used that ID to connect to various VR worlds, converting her character each and every time. Of course, that meant buying a whole new game each time, so she started out with choosing those with a trial period so she could first test them for free. She didn't care about the genre. There were VR games of every kind imaginable. Racing games that put players in driver's seats, flight simulators that allowed anyone to fly an airplane, sci-fi adventures in which characters cruised around the galaxy, virtual versions of any sport one wanted to play, romance games with beautiful women and girls to woo, even some that just simulated a normal day. Once she started trying out all the different VR games on the market, Karen decided to switch a new game anytime she found the slightest flaw in an avatar she rolled. Miu found this stubbornness exasperating, but she didn't give Karen a hard time about it. A few days later, "I found you!" Len exclaimed at the starting area of another new VR game. She'd screamed it, in fact. She was in a world with an eerie, apocalyptic sky and jutting ruins of metallic skyscrapers overhead, staring into the mirrored glass exterior of one such building and proclaiming, "I found you! I finally found you!" She stared at the person in her reflection, not even 5 feet tall, and dressed in green battle fatigues. "I found you!" She was a little girl. At last, Len had found the game she would call her home, Gun Gale Online. As the name suggested, it was a world of guns, where players engaged in shootouts amid post-apocalyptic wasteland scenery. November 2025. 3 months had passed since she started playing the game. Winter had come to Tokyo. Karen had a few hobbies, and no friends in Tokyo, no school club activities, and no permission to take a job. So she went to class every day, studied and completed her assignments, and had plenty of time for the game in between. In keeping with her regimented personality, Karen had decided how many hours she'd spend in GGO on weekdays and how many she'd spend there on her free days. She limited her time before tests. Like Miu had said, VR games were beautifully constructed virtual spaces. They were just like real life in their use of all the bodily senses, but virtual was still virtual. It wasn't possible to match the sheer amount of information in real life. So there was never a moment where she asked herself, "Wait, which side am I on now?" Or in other words, she never had to question which of the two was reality, which in Karen's mind perhaps meant that this game was carefully constructed to avoid such problems. GGO was set on a decrepit, dilapidated Earth after a devastating war, a place without the first hint of beauty. The sky was always some smeared combination of red, yellow paint, no matter what the weather or the time of day, like a sunset gone madly awry. The default terrain consisted of deserts, wastelands, and ruined cities. It had only the bare minimum of greenery, the polar opposite of ALO. The players of GGO were all supposed to be people who came back to Earth on spaceships. In this desolate setting, players hunted grotesque, mutated monsters, killer machines, and on occasion, other groups of players. That was the game in a nutshell. Karen would never have picked GGO out of the plethora of games if it hadn't been for the avatar she wound up with. If it wasn't obvious from the name, guns were the central weapon. In GGO, they came in 2 main categories. The first was optical guns, blaster, ray guns, beam rifles, laser guns. The names were varied, but the concept was the same. These were the guns with science fiction names and appearances that shot amplified light energy rather than bullets. Even with the energy packs, optical guns were light and compact, with long range and considerable accuracy. At the same time, the damage a single shot inflicted was low, and in PvP battles, there were anti-optical defense fields that lowered the damage even further. Those laser guns looked like classic sci-fi weapons, with all straight lines. Accordingly, the game's background, they were used on the spaceships. The other kind of weapon was live ammo guns. These were explained to be the surviving guns still found on Earth, or perhaps new guns, built from the plans for such models. There were actual real-life guns recreated within the game thanks to the blessing and cooperation of the gun manufacturers. Unlike the optical guns, these ones rattled off actual bullets with proper mass. Well, virtual mass anyway. They benefited from each bullet having great power, and from there being no defensive fields to stop them. On the other hand, they were susceptible to wind and other environmental factors, and the ammo was heavy. The common practice among players was to use optical guns on monsters, and live ammo guns against other players. But given how many gun fanatics played GGO, many people said, "To hell with efficiency!" and used their ammo guns on everything, monsters included. Pituhui was one of them. Anyway, Len had wound up with the tiny avatar she was hoping for. Characters under 5 feet tall were quite rare in this game, apparently. Both players and computer-controlled non-player characters, NPCs, seemed to come from an endless stock of burly and menacing types. She couldn't have stuck out more if she tried. When she walked through the neon-drenched sci-fi city nestled among the high-rise buildings, everyone seemed to notice her. "Whoa, she's tiny! What is that? Is that a girl or a boy? Did you see that? There's a kid here!" That's kind of cute. "I didn't know GGO had avatars that small." "Is that an NPC?" With each comment, it became harder for her to keep her mouth under control. She didn't like people seeing her grinning like a madman, so she started covering her mouth with a bandana. Just being a virtual shrimp was fun on its own, but Len was nothing if not principled, and since she had stayed playing this game, she was going to figure out how to do it right. And what could be cooler than being a tiny and deadly fighter? Most games have a tutorial feature that teaches new players the ropes of its controls and functions. In GGO's case, this was an NPC drill sergeant that offered a variety of lessons on how to fire a gun, how to hide behind cover, how to recognize and exploit various types of monsters, and so on. Mio once said, "You don't need to bother with tutorials. You're just wasting your time. Ask a friend and you'll pick it up naturally. Just learn as you go. It's called on-the-job training." But if anything, Karen was better suited for soaking in a lesson on her own. And she had no friends here to ask. This was how Len, who'd never expected to touch a gun in her life, mastered their use in a virtual setting. She also learned all about GGO's unique bullet circle assistance tool. It was an aid to the shooting process that told the player where the bullet would land. Placing a finger against the gun's trigger generated a light green circle visible to the player. When fired, a bullet would land somewhere within that circle at random, no matter how big or small a space the circle covered. The bullet's circle size changed depending on the target's distance, the qualities of the gun, the player's skill. The pulsing of the circle as it grew and shrank was synchronized to the player's heartbeat. In other words, a nervous player whose heart was jackhammering away would have a wildly fluctuating circle with no stability. That might not be the biggest problem in a close-range shootout, but to snipers, it meant everything. One of the tutorial lessons was about learning to snipe, and it was this process of calming her heart in order to aim that Len found toughest. She got horrible marks, and the NPC sergeant was all over her for it. "Yeah, I'm not going to use a sniper rifle," she said. Everyone was suited for certain things, and not suited for others. She would move on from this one without regret. On the other hand, her lesson in snap shooting, where she took quick aim at close range, was a surprising success. The instructor said, "Nice work. You're best suited for using a submachine gun." And she had received her recommendation. Once she dutifully concluded every last part of the tutorial, Len headed out on her own to fight some monsters. Her first battle had been in a hilly region just outside the city, where she settled on a beast that looked like a cross between a plodding swine and an ostrich. She'd felt bad about shooting a largely docile creature, but when it came time to fire, she didn't hesitate to pull the trigger on the optical gun. The gun had merely produced a red glowing spot, known as the bullet hole effect, on the target, and upon dying, it burst into little particles of light and vanished. Psychologically, this lessened the effect of hunting and killing a living creature. Len took the game seriously. She carried out the lesson she'd been taught and stayed away from monsters she knew she couldn't beat. And if she got killed, she thought hard about where she'd gone wrong. When she simply couldn't win against certain monsters, she'd visit a strategy website and look up the best way to kill it. It's often the simplest efforts that lead to the most solid growth. As Len defeated monster after monster, she earned experience points and credits, the name of the in-game currency. Once she learned enough experience, she could raise her statistics. There were 6 attributes to choose from: strength, agility, durability, endurance, dexterity, intelligence, and luck. By making choices among the 6, she could build her ideal self. Since she was already small, she decided she might as well raise her agility so she could run faster. If she had dexterity, she could use it to craft things. Having good luck never hurt. Don't forget strength. Some guns were unusable without enough of it. Durability wasn't a big deal since she was fine with being fragile. Intelligence? What's that? So Len focused on agility and dexterity, with strength and luck as a substat. Her choices were based in no small part on the trauma of always coming in last in foot races due to her huge size in real life. Once she had more credits to use, she was able to add on more guns and gear. She switched out her optical gun for a submachine gun with a high rate of fire. She decided to spend the rest of her credits on a new outfit. She was finally cute and petite, and she wanted some clothes that would take advantage of that. This was clearly the wrong choice for the desolate sci-fi wasteland of GGO, but she didn't care. Len went to the town tailor, combat outfitter, and excitedly looked through the offerings for something cute. This was GGO, so there were no frilly dresses. She found no Lolita fashion, which she'd been so terribly excited about after seeing it in magazines in middle school, but given up on wearing as long as she continued to have the dimensions of a eucalyptus tree. Instead, she found a system that allowed her to change the color of the starter combat suit she was still wearing. This was the sort of thing video games were for. Len went for pink. In the real world, she'd been unable to wear pink no matter how much she wanted to. But if Karen wasn't the right look for it, surely Len was. Sadly, the one shade of pink available to sample was not the kind of vivid, bright pink she always wanted. It was a dull, shaded pink, a tint rarely seen in real life. Still, pink was pink. She changed both pieces of her current combat gear to the color, then kept going until her boots, bandana, gloves, equipment belt, and even the knit cap that kept her hair under control during battle were all the same color. Len left the business, silently humming with pleasure in her all-pink outfit, and caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the store window. Her eyebrows furrowed. Yeah, something was still off. She raced to a weapons customization shop and asked for paint. She was going to have that dark gray optical gun painted the same shade of pink. Now Len was properly pink from head to toe, and so was the deadly-looking weapon she carried. She was like some kind of TV character. Some people who'd spotted her looking like this had laughed, and others had said that she was very cute at that size. Some had even been mystified about her gender, since her close-cropped hair wasn't a major signifier. Len had chosen the look for fun, and it was just a game. Nobody knew the real her, so she wasn't bothered by this now. But it was the first and last time she wore pink in town. Shortly afterward, Len killed another player for the first time. She was enjoying her monster battling and didn't have the slightest desire to kill other players in a gun battle yet. Her gun was for monsters. She didn't want to go down the path of murderer, even if it was just virtual. Like any other day, Len went into the reddened waste in search of monster prey. The sun was high above in the haze, but the sky and earth were as red as ever. Like a sunrise or sunset, according to the game's story, the apocalyptic war had even destroyed the Earth's atmosphere. She prowled the rocky desert dotted with the husks of ancient tanks, waiting for monsters to appear. In this environment, creatures like crocodiles with the torso of a cow dug holes under the tanks for shelter. With her higher dexterity value, Len was able to fashion traps of grenades and slender wires around the vehicles. When one of the giant crocs hit the wires, the resulting blast would make it easy for her to spot. Then she just had to close the gap, avoid the creature's attack, and blast it with her optical gun at close range, where she couldn't miss. That was how Len did things. She had nothing else to do while she waited, so she sat against a boulder a short distance away and listened to music, like always. By using a music player and earphones, which existed in the game world ad items, she would call upon the music files saved to her ammosphere. There she sat all alone, gun in hand, outfitted in all pink, letting time pass her by in the wasteland. Len enjoyed doing things she could never do in the real world. At times, she would open her menu screen and retrieve a thermos, hot tea from her item storage, so she could sit back and sip it. Her item storage was something like an invisible bag. If she put things there, she didn't have to carry them around manually, but the maximum space limit depended on her character's strength, so it wasn't like she could just put anything in there. The weight limit on her storage was the same as weight limit she could physically carry. In order to retrieve her items, she needed to wave her hand in the air to call up the window. No matter how quick someone was, the process always took a few seconds, which ensured that if they needed to use a weapon or ammo immediately, they needed to carry it. Normally, she ought to have her storage stuffed with backup weapons and healing solutions. That's good tea. But Len preferred to save space for her thermos and snacks, even if it meant less ammo. VR games could even simulate the sense of taste. Of course, she was going to make use of that. She could drink all she wanted and not gain weight. When the Mozart piece was finished, she switched over to Elsa Kanzaki album. She was a female singer-songwriter whose renown was rising rapidly. Her melodies were rich and classical, while her voice was clear and the lyrics welcoming. Kieran had heard about her through a friend and was now a total fan. It was this pleasant and charming music that played as Len sat amid blasted desolation. The album finished, and there were still no explosions. Perhaps that day's stakeout was a bust. At any rate, she'd enjoyed a good picnic, so she was ready to return to the real world. Just then, people showed up. 3 men appeared from around the rocks dead ahead, about 200 yards away, and began walking straight toward her. She hadn't noticed them at all, because they'd been climbing a slope before that. All 3 were big and buff, wearing armor like protectors, and carried huge optical guns in their slings. In this particular game, when players met with one another in the open, unless someone was particularly close or familiar with the other side, it was more likely that a gunfight would break out instead of a conversation. People often said, "In GGO, we let our guns do the talking." They came closer and closer. A tough-looking team, while she was all alone and complete amateur when it came to battling other players. Len was racked with fear, greater than she'd felt facing giant monsters. Numerous questions exploded in her mind. Should I run away? Or should I cut
my connection and escape back into the real world. No, most important of all, why are they coming straight toward me with their guns raised? Without a firm decision in hand, all Len could do was stand there and watch them. Eventually, they were within 30 yards, at which she could hear them happily chatting about their gun specs. That was when she realized they weren't aware of her presence. They had no idea she was there. They came closer. Closer. Within 10 yards at that point. An unfortunate incident was about to befall them, but it would change Len's GGO playstyle forever. First, a small explosion occurred behind Len, who'd been directly facing the men. At last, the giant crocodile she'd been waiting for had set off her grenade trap. The men had no idea about this, of course. They panicked at the sudden eruption, and they were so distracted by the burst of sand beyond the rocks, they didn't even notice that Len had started moving. The explosion had driven off Len's fear. At this point, it was a simple, self-abandoning drive her actions. She'd do her best and let things happen organically. She snatched up the pink optical gun from her lap and rushed forward, spraying fire at the closest man. His anti-optical defense field slowed the progress of her shots, but eventually a few hit his face at close range. By then, she was within 2 or 3 yards of the other 2 men. She fired and fired and fired, always tilting her gun upward at the tall targets. Once that 10-second stretch of madness was over, there was no sight of the 3 men anymore. They'd all run out of hit points due to the barrage of extreme close range. They were dead. The only thing left in the desert was Len, heart leaping into her throat with excitement, and the giant crocodile, which was in agony after setting off the trap near the tank. Why did those 3 not notice me at all? The crocodile had been put out of its misery. Len tried to figure out the answer. Maybe she had an idea. She placed her pink gun against the shadow of the rock where she'd been sitting, then moved away from it. It was instantly obvious that her hypothesis was correct. The gun she had left behind was invisible now. Under the reddish sunset light that always shone in the world of GGO, Len's faded pink gun blended right into the brown rock and sand, so much that it was almost impossible to pick out. With the amount of light in the sky at this particular moment, it was completely invisible. This is neat. I think I can make use of this, she muttered. After that, Len never wore her pink outfit in town. She didn't want people coming after her for revenge. Instead, she bought a plain green combat suit and a burnt brown hooded robe that covered her body and face. She felt like a kid putting on a blanket over her head and pretending to be a ghost. But at least it was less attention-grabbing than wearing all pink. Once she was out in the wasteland and desert, she would change into her beloved pink gear when no one was watching, and begin laying her ambush. For the most part, she hunted monsters like always, but if she caught a glimpse of another player, she changed targets without mercy. If they were coming toward her, she'd hide and wait. She wouldn't move a muscle. Once she knew that her opponents were a number she could beat, usually 1 or 2 at most, she would leap out when they were very close, down them in hail of shots. She couldn't even remember that when she had started the game, her thoughts on the matter had been, I don't want to shoot anything resembling people. Even for successful hiding attempts, she wouldn't pull the trigger if there were too many enemies, if they didn't come close enough, or if their gear looked too powerful. She'd either wait them out in hiding or steadily back away until she could retreat without a sound. This was how Len got hooked on PvP battling. It reminded her of playing tag, hide and seek, and cops and robbers with her older brothers and sisters as a kid. A thrill of hiding and the excitement of finding. And now the superiority of killing the opponent. So this is what it means to fight your hardest with a game and enjoy the competition. Now that she'd gained a deeper understanding of GGO, Len silently apologized to the gamer she'd always made fun of in her mind. With the experience she gained from fighting monsters and people, Len pushed her agility even higher, making her quicker to react and her legs even faster than before. Completely unbeknownst to her at the time, the practice of focusing directly on agility was called the AGI superiority model, as it was considered the most useful statistic in PvP combat. She had used the credits she earned to buy herself live ammo guns for fighting against other player. It took all her budget and smarts to arrive at the VZ-61 Scorpion, a submachine gun from the former Czechoslovakia. It was 27 inches long, with a stock folded, making it one of the smallest and lightest SMGs in the world. Although it used small pistol bullets, it could deplete an entire 30-round magazine in less than 2 seconds. It had low power, but the little recoil, thus better accuracy. Len had bought 2, removed the stock, painted them pink. Like the name suggested, her style was like a sting from a scorpion's tail, certain death in one shot. When other players passed her within a range of 10 yards, she would rush them with her considerable agility. A scorpion in each hand, she'd point at their heads and blaze the weapon's fully automatic fire, as though stabbing upward with that stinger. With the right hand scorpion against a single foe, or perhaps the left as well, if there were 2. GGO had another system tool called the bullet line. This was a red line that the targeted player could see except for the first shot from an enemy whose location was unknown. If the case of sniping or ambush, it allowed players to see an incoming bullet's trajectory and take the evasive action. This was a defensive handicap to make the game more fun overall, and obviously not a thing that existed in real life. One of the basic elements of PvP combat in GGO was being able to spot a bullet line and move out of its way with a minimum of movement. But that didn't help when a gun barreled within 10 feet essentially hit its target at the same time it fired. The moment that they would have spotted the bullet line was the moment the automatic fire would have sprayed them in the face. Len had devised a truly merciless method of killing, making full use of the gun's properties, much like a communist assassin from the Cold War. It was in this manner that she had learned and grew as a player from each and every experience. One day, she was crushing monsters. The next, she might be blasting some pathetic loser. At last, one day, Len overheard a rumor while she was in her bulky robe in town. There's some horrifying, unknown player killer ambushing people out in the desert. A bunch of solo players have been ganked before they even see who it is. A kind of vigilante team was putting plans together to use a player as bait so they could figure out who this PKing bastard was. Before long, they'd be placing a bounty on her head, too. Len saw the effect her activities were having and decided to stop laying ambushes that might be considered foul play. After that point, she wore her ordinary green camo in the forest region, hunting monsters and exploring ruined buildings. She had been playing for over 3 months. Now in the final month of 2025, Len had played enough to be in the middle skill levels of the game's population. She had no idea that this was the case, though. That was when she met the woman who called herself Pitohui.